Okay, so Giorgia, it is a delight to be with you here in Rome at the Global Financial Services Tax Leader Conference. We're going to talk for a few minutes about a provision that's maybe gotten a little bit of attention in recent days, and that is, of course, Section 899, proposed by the House of Representatives in the version of the reconciliation bill that passed a few weeks ago, came over to the Senate. Now the Senate has proposed a revised version of Section 899. So both the House and the Senate now, in each of their respective versions of the bill, includes some version of Section 899. Talk to us a little bit about sort of how do we see Section 899 affecting, I'll call it the international tax landscape?
So I think, Pat, this is a really big break with respect to the previous 12 years, where we have invested a lot of resources in this big, complex multilateral agreements, whereby the nature of a multilateral agreement is about restraining taxing rights of other countries. And I have to say, in these agreements, some countries were more restrained than others, but I think really what Section 899 tells us that we are in a new world where it will be very difficult going forward, not only in the next 3-4 years,
Right.
but even beyond that, it will be more difficult to restrain the taxing rights of the US, essentially.
Right. Now, that's from the perspective of the United States. Let's talk about it from the perspective of other countries. How are they looking at Section 899 and how might they respond?
So but probably the first thing we want to say that Section 899 was, in its sophistication, a bit of a shock on this side of the world, really. And I think it really forces the supporters of Pillar 2, the supporters of digital services taxes, back on the table, and it forces them to face a very thorny question. So from the one hand, countries could concede to the demands of US Treasury, but that, of course, will possibly make their multinationals less competitive, unless, of course, we get rid of Pillar 2, which is most probably not going to happen. And I think there is another issue, because Pillar 2 has been sold to the public, if you want, and DST as well, governments will have a hard time convincing voters that eliminating Pillar 2 or conceding to the US is the right way to go.
Right.
On the other side, you could push back on the US requests, but you'll face trade consequences with your most important partner, essentially. And with the market, the US market, that remains probably the most valuable market for many, many multinationals around the world. So very difficult question back on the table because of Section 899.
Yeah, so a couple of things there, George, I just want to dig into for a second. So one, I think this is a really helpful perspective for me from the United States, hearing the non-US perspective of just how much Pillar 2 and digital services taxes became a part of the political dialogue, particularly over here in Europe, about the need to attack or address multinational company tax avoidance, preventing things like a race to the bottom, et cetera, et cetera. So that dialogue, you're saying, essentially has become part of the political vocabulary, making it a little bit harder to sort of walk away from that completely. Obviously, the consequences of not being willing to make any change whatsoever is to face repercussions in the form of something like Section 899, which makes it harder or more expensive for non-US companies to access the US market. So obviously a bit of tension there. It's possible, is it not, Georgia, that there's sort of there's a meeting of somewhere in the middle here, that they're going to be not getting rid of Pillar 2, but changes to Pillar 2. That certainly seems to be the direction that Section 899 at least opens the door to. The idea that maybe it's not all of Pillar 2, it's just the UTPR and only certain aspects of the UTPR. So how do you see that kind of, are we at the start of a negotiation here? How do you see that?
Definitely, Pat. So the good news is that there is a negotiation there. There is a negotiation for sure on the UTPR, on Pillar 2, and various actors in this part of the world are willing to find a compromise, okay? Whether that's a safe harbor or other more technical approaches to lessen the effect of QDMTTs, for example. I think the discussions are very real. I think that policymakers are now more open to the input of businesses and understanding how this could work. So, very good news there, I think. There remains an issue. If Europe and other countries such as the UK, Japan, and a few other countries around the world want to stick with Pillar 2,
right.
they could have a competitiveness issue.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's difficult.
So up to now, most of what we've talked about in this conversation has been from the perspective of governments. Let's shift focus for the last question here, which is really just, how about the companies themselves? Because they really are, in effect, the ones who have to face the burden of Section 899. You talked about the concerns that governments have about competitiveness of their economies, maybe also competitiveness of their companies, but that's all talk. The companies who are affected by Section 899 are going to have to decide how it might change their behavior, what they might do differently. So how do you see that?
Yeah, so I think that there are at the moment, for companies, Section 899 has become an important issue that goes up to the board. It's on all newspapers.
Right.
For those who are very much exposed to the US market, could be a very higher cost, really. So there is a lot of understanding of what the effects could be, and discussions with policymakers about those very effects. Now we are really at the beginning part. We need to see whether those discussions will be impactful and where they will take us. But it's a very different world from what we saw just 6 months ago. Okay, and I think the worry for companies here, from the one hand, is operating in the US will be more expensive. That's bad because the US for many European multinationals is a very important market, as I was saying before. The other worry is, will I become less competitive if Pillar 2 is only applied to a part of the world, or to my part of the world, essentially. The other, and of course, because there is so much pressure at very high level now on companies, we are seeing companies thinking about different options. Now, how can I mitigate the effects of Section 899?
Sure. And a point, Giorgia, you've made to me in the past about this idea of talking to your government or advocacy. We in the United States, of course, are very familiar with the idea of going and talking to members of Congress or talking to the administration about policy changes. Not quite as much familiarity with that amongst European companies.
I agree. It's more difficult in Europe, but for various reasons. But the discussions are not as easy as in the US. And in the last 12 years, we know that the input of business has not been particularly important in shaping welcomed shaping the tax reform. So we are coming from that legacy. It's not going to be easy to switch to a different approach, in 24 hours. Say.
Look, we could go on a lot longer, Giorgia, but we're going to have to leave it there. So thank you so much for providing your insights to the audience.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you for having me.